Most of the trees are already bare, the leaves have fallen, the sky is grey, and the sun is weak. In most European cultures, winter is associated with death, and spring with the rebirth of life. And that's easy to see if you look around you. Everything seems to be closing up and dying. Old animals, old humans in pre-modern societies often found winter very hard to bear, and there would be more deaths in winter. And in spring is when all the little animals would come back into the fields and the grass would grow again. If winter is a time when things end, from a purely biological or botanical point of view, we know that that's not actually the case, because all these things that die, they end up in the ground, feeding the ground, and spring wouldn't be possible without the annual regeneration through all this organic material which becomes eaten up and provides nourishment for everything again. That's an explanation that, of course, in pre-modern societies, everybody who worked with agriculture, they knew. And the majority of people in pre-modern societies did work with agriculture. Nevertheless, as one of my students eloquently put it, there's got to be some more reason to life than just ending it as worm food. What happens to us humans after death is something that few societies have been able to accept as a biological process, that we become compost and end up as worm food. Indigenous societies who believe that the spirit remains, but it moves back and forth between different entities, human, animal, vegetable, and mineral, are more or less able to accept this, the worm food notion of death, because the spirit is everywhere. But other societies have always come up with means of trying to explain what happens after death. Because humans have found it impossible to accept that everything ends. And so, if we think of the main so-called world religions, we find that the way of approaching death is often at the core of their philosophy or their theology. And indeed, even if we go back to the ancient Greeks, Plato's Phaedo is also at its core a way of trying to explain what happens after death and whether the soul indeed is immortal or not. The immortality of the soul in one way or another is something that is inherent in the main world religion traditions as we know them. In the large monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam and Christianity, there is always a sense that there is a possibility, at least, for some kind of heaven or some kind of hell. In traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, it's reincarnation that happens, and the concern is with a means of being reincarnated as a higher being until at some point the cycle of reincarnation stops and one becomes united with the eternal, unchanging divinity of some sort. Now, in modern societies, we live with a cult of immortality, which is somewhat different. Everything is geared towards pretending that death won't happen, that we can push it away, that we can elongate our lives as long as we want. Well, that's what we hope anyway. And coping with death is something which often tends to be viewed in a rather negative fashion. Grief and mourning have sort of prescribed times that they're allowed, and after that one is supposed to get over it and move on, which is a very unhealthy attitude in my view. We live insulated from the sight of death. Everything happens cleanly somewhere else. We don't see dead bodies on the ground of animals or of humans. And we don't see the connection between winter and death because we don't feel the winter that much. Because we have insulated homes. Those of us, at least, who are lucky to have a reasonable income, we have insulated homes, insulated public transport, insulated cars, and central heating. That's at least the case in North America and Europe, not so much in the UK. Anyway, as a result of this, we think of death, if we do at all, in very different ways. It's not always present. Mothers who aren't about to die every time they have a baby, whereas in medieval Western Europe and in all pre-modern societies, maternal mortality and infant mortality rates were very high. So it was not uncommon for wealthy women, when they were about to have a baby, to seek indulgences for their sins, so that if they died in childbirth, they would at least die having some of their sins removed from them. And why does this matter? This matters because by the late medieval period in Western Europe, there had come to be an economy of salvation by which there was a sort of calculation of sinfulness equals so many years in purgatory and then hell, possibly, which could be mitigated by various good deeds, but also, well, one of the good deeds would have been supporting the building of the fabric of a church, or endowing a church or a religious institution to say prayers for one's soul. And eventually these ended up in a system of indulgences whereby one could pay to receive an indulgence which would take off 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years in purgatory and bring one closer to an eternal life in heaven. Now, because of this, in Western Europe, they also developed a practice and theory of how to die well. There were a number of texts in the 15th century which spoke of the practice of dying well and how one might do it. A lot of these texts focused on the last days, the provisions that one should make in one's will, the confession that one must make to the confessor, how one must try and bring oneself into a prayerful attitude of trust and faith in God. But the notion of dying well also carried with it a notion of how one must live a life leading towards salvation. My research was intended to poke at this and try and understand, first of all, how working with the idea of a good life leading to a good death, how did that affect decisions made in life and decisions made at the end of life, For example, what kind of provisions did people make in their wills? Whom did they donate their bequests to? Were they more or less interested as time went on in donating to religious institutions, and with what conditions? But I was also interested in trying to find out whether this concern with a good death was manifested in these kinds of manuals. There are a number of texts, as I said, called the artes moriendi, the arts of dying, whether such things existed in other cultures and how they related to what we find in Latin Western Europe. The third strand of my research was interested in trying to find out how what people did as they approached death related to economic change. Now that might sound like a very strange thing to say, but one of the theories in economic history has been that there was a shift from a culture of conspicuous consumption and then a donation of one's assets to religious institutions because of a fear of the consequences of the sinful acts one had committed during life, removing, in other words, a certain amount of money from circulation for investment. There was a shift from this to a culture in which investment and growth became more important, and keeping money for investment became more important. It's not as simple as that, because we also find then in this new culture a rise of philanthropy, and it's a matter of debate the extent to which philanthropic donations are keeping money in circulation for a capitalist system or taking it out. There's plenty of evidence that people were scared of dying and purgatory and hell, and they were scared enough that they did indeed put a lot of their assets into endowing religious institutions. One of the things that they did, though, was endowing religious institutions very often in such a way that their name was also to be remembered publicly in perpetuity. When masses were sung for them because they had left money for that, their name was also sung. When they endowed a stained glass window, very often their heraldic emblem, or even just an image of somebody supposed to represent them, was included in the stained glass window, and so on. So these means of commemoration were means of seeking salvation for the soul through prayer, through pious bequests that allowed a church to be built, but also a means of ensuring remembrance in one's society, because the names, the images, would continue to be there after one had died. Now, it is a debatable point whether this was solely pious, that is to say, when a descendant of the deceased saw the image in the stained glass window, that descendant was supposed to pray for the deceased person, or whether there was also a matter of social status being asserted, which descendants could also draw on as being the descendants of these people who were there in these big stained glass windows in the city's cathedral. As I walk around the campus of the University of Toronto, I've always been struck by the fact that at some level, one thing hasn't changed, which is that when people leave money and when people die, they also want to be commemorated, that is, remembered together, remembered by other people as well. I'm sitting on a bench. There are other benches here. Many of these benches have little plaques on them which remember somebody. I'm sitting in the quadrangle of University College. Around me is the Daniel Wilson Hall. Up there is Morrison Hall. My fellowship was held at the Jackman Humanities Institute, which is in the Jackman Humanities building, which is only one of many buildings at the University of Toronto and around Toronto which bear the Jackman name. These names live on even after death, and they're intended to live on even after death. And it strikes me that they're as much an effort to maintain immortality, in a different way perhaps, as the saying of masses for an individual, where the individual would be named, or the copying of a person's name into a necrology, where every year when that date was reached, that person's name would be sung in mass, or of course things like stained glass windows with images of the benefactor. We are, of course, supposed to remember Sir Daniel Wilson when we sit here. We are supposed to remember Morrison, whoever he was, when we go into Morrison Hall. And we are supposed to remember the Honourable Henry Jackman when we go into the Jackman Humanities building. We can hardly help it. We certainly know that there is some Jackman or Morrison or Wilson or Robarts or whoever associated with these things. So what I intended to do during this project was something of a risk. It was looking for things in other religious traditions with which I had no familiarity. It was trying to combine an approach drawing on the disciplines of history and religious studies and anthropology regarding what people did when they died, from a religious sense of need to do something for their souls, with economic changes, and with a hunch, no more than a hunch, that one of the ways in which the economy did change over the course of the 400 years between about 400 and 1800, one of the ways in which the economy changed was more of a concern in investment and reinvestment, which is one of the elements of Max Weber's Protestant ethic, and less of a concern with investing money for the sake of one's soul. It's perhaps I don't know how to describe it, but it's a coincidence, perhaps, that a few months before I started on this project, a very close family member passed away, and as I make this video now, another person very close to me has been diagnosed with something that doesn't really die, with terminal liver cancer. So death has been on my mind from a personal point of view as well, and that has colored what I have thought and the research that I have done. I don't have results, and this was not intended to be something that would have results as such. It was intended to be an effort to try and see whether one can, in fact, join together different ways of looking at how humans deal with the fact that they are alive and the fact that they will die, and how that influences their notion of a good life, by which I mean not a life which is necessarily just happy or provides material comforts, but a good life from a moral sense. And while it is clear now to me that there was a shift between the preponderance of bequests to religious institutions for charity with the stipulation that the poor receiving these donations should pray for one's soul, there was a shift from that to an increase in reinvestment to a divorce of a sense of moral underpinning to what the economy was. But it's not as simple as that, as I had thought, because the question of modern philanthropy and its sort of origins in the decades around 1800, I think of the early British industrialists who built new towns for their workers with modern sanitation, and the late 19th century with electric lighting and schools and so on. And of course, the people who put their names on buildings that they have paid for. This doesn't quite match with the notion that people stopped being scared of purgatory and hell, and therefore they stopped making pious donations so much, and they started instead simply to reinvest, and to reinvest without thinking of the morality of the economic labor that their money did. Whereas it is clear from late medieval wills that people did think of the morality of the economic labor that their money did, and they found it lacking. And therefore, to atone for their sins as merchants and bankers and businessmen, they made pious bequests. I don't know enough about the modern period, so it's hard for me to wonder and ascertain whether modern philanthropists are doing this for the sake of their soul. But it's clear that they're doing it for the sake of commemoration and remembrance, and it's clear that they're doing it with some kind of moral purpose as well. In most cases, of course, not in every single case, because there are also philanthropists who donate to things which one might think are less moral. So morality, if not religion, still plays a role. And my question then sort of morphs into something else, which is how can we consider a shift from an economic system which was underlain by a sense of morality and fairness, and which incited people who became wealthy in this system to consider that what they had done was sinful, and therefore to provide money to religious institutions or for religious purposes, both for their social commemoration, but also for the sake of their souls. How does this shift from that to a system in which people live and work in an economy where there is actually no sense of a moral underpinning, and the economy is supposed to follow laws that are somehow independent of morality, and the people who get rich in this economy frequently donate very large sums of money for purposes that are supposed to be, or are viewed as, to be good. And certainly I think donating to a humanities institute or to a faculty of medicine is something which is good from a moral sense. How do these changes in terms of morality and religion and morality and philanthropy, which is not directly linked to religion, how do they correlate with the changes from an economy with a moral basis to an economy without? And I don't have answers for this, but I was not hoping to. I was hoping to spend some time to think about the questions and read around to try and figure out how I might even approach these questions. I didn't have a lot of luck with finding anything in other religious traditions regarding the art of dying well, which is not to say that these things don't exist, but clearly they are not immediately apparent. And so I'm still not quite sure how to approach this from a comparative perspective. But I've got to some clarity about the questions I'm trying to ask and how they relate to each other. And I'm happy to say that I have 2 doctoral students who are also asking these questions, though restricted to late medieval Europe at the moment, and working on very exciting dissertations regarding wealth and the often rather dodgy ways in which this wealth was acquired and the things people did with their wealth as they died, both to ensure their social commemoration and for the sake of their souls. I'm certainly very excited to see the results of my students' research, and over time, along with these and future students, I hope I shall also be able to provide some results originating in my time as a Jackman Fellow.